I just want to say thank you so much for being here today. It's a real honor. It's a pleasure to have everyone here. By way of introduction, I'm Patty Robinson. I'm the Faculty Director of Civic and Community Engagement at College of the Canyons in Southern California. And I'm going to introduce my colleagues in just a moment, but just for those of you who are new, what we ask everyone to do is to mute themselves, again, just for background noise, but that doesn't mean that you can't unmute or ask questions. And then also, we'd like you to put your name and your institution in the chat, please. And that way we know who is here today. But as I said, I'm Patty Robinson. I'm joined by my colleague and co-facilitator, Kimberly Rosenfeld, who is the chair of Women and Gender Studies and chair of the Education Department at Cerritos College, just down the freeway here in Southern California from our college. And then we're also joined by Crystal Kiekel from Pierce College, who is helping with 3CSN today, and we're really happy. So she is over in another part of Los Angeles County, but again, we're all working to help facilitate this program today. When we talk about our program, just as a way of understanding 3CSN is our success networking team here in the California Community College system. This recording or this presentation is being recorded. This recording will be uploaded to the YouTube site for 3CSN. So this is a great way, again, to have all of this information documented and to serve as a repository. Just as a quick history of how this group got started, Kimberly and I were working with the Bringing Theory to Practice grant several years ago, along with colleagues from CSU Dominguez Hills, Cal State Northridge, along with later Cal State Los Angeles and LA City College. With the work that we were doing, we were trying to create a civic engagement pathway. One of the deliverables that we wanted to do was to actually have an in-person training, but unfortunately COVID hit. Well, with COVID, we had to think of something different. And so we created a speaker series. We thought this speaker series would last 1 month, basically. It is now into its 4th year. So we're really excited about this. We have introduced the campus communities up and down the state to many of the nation's top scholars, researchers, and practitioners of civic and community engagement to a varied audience. As I said, most of whom have come from California, but we've also had participants coming from outside of California as well. Our main audience has focused on community college practitioners and faculty in the state. And our goal is to actually revise, renew, reimagine the civic mission of higher education, particularly the idea of community colleges as democracy's colleges. Today's presentation is focused in 2 parts. The first hour is the speaker presentation with our honored guest, who Kimberly will introduce in just a moment. And the second hour is our deep dive. This is where Kimberly and I will take folks who would like to talk about some of the topics from today's presentation in greater detail. And finally, our guiding frameworks for our presentations today, or at least civic dialogues in the more general sense, revolve around our understanding of the intersection between equity, agency, and civic engagement to promote the public good, recognize civic community and democratic engagement as a high impact practice for guided pathways and student success, and how we can leverage your current knowledge to build capacity to involve or innovate for local, national, and global change. And so with that, it is our honor to introduce John Reif and Cynthia Leach, and I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly.
Hello. Yes, I am going to, I believe, introduce Cynthia, and then Patty, you're going to take John to break it up a little. Cynthia Lynch is a veteran of over 25 years in higher education. She's the Assistant Vice Provost for Civic Engagement and Academic Strategic Support at Salem State University. She's a practitioner scholar of civic engagement and its intersections with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Cynthia provides the strategic vision and leadership for the university's public engagement initiatives. She also oversees the development of programs that support faculty using anti-racist, community-engaged pedagogies and students developing the skills necessary to engage in all spheres of civic life. And to think critically and work creatively to address injustices facing our communities. Her research focuses on critically engaged civic learning, a framework that restructures service learning approaches to achieve more equitable and just engagement with the community. And her work appears in all types of places, including AAC&U. And her first book, Anti-Racist Community Engagement Principles and Practices, was released in September of 2023. Congratulations, Cynthia. And Lynch is finally a co-founder of the New England Equity and Engagement Consortium and is an Equity and Engagement Fellow for Campus Compact. All right, and that is Cynthia. So I'm going to turn it over to Patty, who will introduce John briefly.
Yes, and I just want to say I've had the pleasure of being in various conference settings with both Cynthia and John, and that's how I actually have met them. And moving forward directly to John's bio, Dr. John Reeve has worked with civic engagement and service learning in higher education since 1980 as a college teacher, as director of service learning / civic engagement offices at a small private college in Tennessee, and then at UMass Amherst. Then since 2015 as Director of Civic Learning and Engagement for the Massachusetts Department of Higher Ed. In this role, he works with the state's 29 public colleges and universities to make civic learning an expected outcome for their undergraduates, convening faculty and staff to explore how they can build civic learning and engagement into their work. His scholarship, most often written with colleagues, appears in various journals and edited books on the engaged campus, service learning, and community engagement. These are his focus, or what he particularly focuses on, and the Carnegie Community Engagement Classification. He consults with the colleges and universities across the U.S. with regard to these topics. In 2018, the DEE adopted racial equity as its top policy and performance priority for public higher education. And since then, Dr. Reeve has focused primarily on helping faculty build anti-racist approaches into community engaged teaching. He worked with a team of faculty to design a framework for the civic learning through the lens of racial equity as a resource for faculty development across the state. He also worked with 7 colleagues to edit a book, Anti-Racist Community Engagement, Principles and Practices, published in September 2023 by Campus Compact, for whom he serves as an Equity and Engagement Fellow. And so this is the same book where he and Cynthia have an article, or they worked very hard on putting this together. And I know John just held up the book, and it is available. You can get it on Amazon. I have my copy as well. So we're going to turn it over to Cynthia and John.
Okay, and Patty, I just need to make one edit to your introduction. My last name rhymes with life, so it's John Rife, and it also rhymes with strife, so you can rhyme it either way.
And excuse me, John, I've always known you as just John, so I apologize for the error in the pronunciation.
That's quite all right. Quite all right.
Super. So I'll kick you off. I want to thank you, Patty and Kimberly, for those introductions and for inviting John and I here today. We're really excited to talk about this. Has really been a labor of love over the last 4 to 5 years, working on the principles for anti-racist community engagement, and then working with 6 other amazing co-editors on editing this book. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me share my screen. Yes. Can folks see it? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Super. So today, John and I are going to talk about activating anti-racist community principles and practices. The overall agenda of the hour that we're going to lead is, first, I'm going to talk about how we develop the principles, because it was a really intentional practice that was also done with an anti-racist lens. Then we're going to do a deep dive into the 4 principles. I'm going to dive into principles 1 and 3. John will dive into principles 2 and 4. And with each of those, we'll explain the principle. And then we will give an example from the book. So the book itself is organized according to the 4 principles, with about 5 to 6 chapters per principle. So we'll give an example of one that demonstrates the principle in action, in practice. And then we're going to open it up to a couple of discussion prompts for the whole group to discuss on that principle. And then we'll move on to the second principle and so forth. After we've discussed the 4 principles, John is going to talk about what we've done since with the principles and with this work on anti-racist community engagement and close with Q&A. So with that, I will begin. So in 2019, 3 universities in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts decided to apply for, and we received a grant to develop professional development for a new part of the faculty contract that had just come out that was allowing community engaged scholarship, teaching, and service to be tenure earning activities. So this was new, and junior faculty really didn't know how to go about it, nor did evaluators. So we developed a series of professional development around it. And then at the end of it, a 4th institution joined us. And in discussions, what's next, we realized, we have some good professional development, but we have no way of knowing all these practices that students and faculty are going about doing within their classrooms and community. Equitable? Are they anti-racist? Are they best practice? So we really sought out to do some research to decide and learn about that. We again applied for a second. It's a HYPE grant, which is Higher Ed Innovation Fund out of the Department of Higher Ed. And we've got a 4-institution consortium grant titled Valuing the Cultural Wealth of Minoritized Students and Communities. And the first part of this was really doing research on ourselves, each institution. What are our practices? What is our data telling us? We scoured the best practice literature. And then based on that, we led focus groups throughout the Commonwealth of students. We had student leaders leading these focus groups and got a host of information, lots of participation, lots of information. We analyzed the data, the themes, and came up with a very rough draft of the principles. We then took this very rough draft of the principles out to the community, and we held focus groups across the whole state with community partnerships, allowing them to look at their lens on these principles, because they are the experts in the field. They are the experts in a lot of this work. And having led a couple of those forums, the information was invaluable. They really determined a lot of the work in the principles. So then we revised, and came up with the set of principles, which I'm about to show you. But first, I'm going to share with you a couple of definitions, just so that you see the words and what we're talking about. So you can see, I'll let you read it, but anti-racist, the definition for community engaged, and cultural wealth. And then I'm going to show you how we put it together. The anti-racist community engaged teaching, when it's put all together, builds on students' cultural wealth that connotes an approach to pedagogy that actively works to dismantle racism through classroom practices, includes equitable collaboration with community partners, and builds on students' cultural wealth in this work. So with that, these are the 4 principles that we've developed. And you can see that each of the 4 principles has 5 elements under them. As you read the elements, you'll say, oh, some sound like 5.5, because some are pretty, a lot of stuff in many of the elements. But principle 1 is counteracting the persistence and impact of racism on our campuses and in our community engagement, reframing our institutional and pedagogical practices. And this one really is focusing on our community and how do we work equitably and in an anti-racist way with our community. Principle 2 is critical reflection on individual and systemic structural racism, understanding positionality, bias, and historic roots of systemic racism. This is doing the work that you need to do to really engage with communities in an anti-racist way in order to start dismantling systemic racism. The third principle is intentional course design, developing anti-racist learning goals, course content, policies, and assessment. And this one is about what happens in the classroom. With communities, so, the projects that, faculty and communities engage in. And the fourth one is compassionate and reflective classroom, creating a sense of belonging in the classroom by acknowledging student contributions and meeting students where they are. So now I am going to begin our deep dive into Principle 1. So Principle 1 calls on us to shift power dynamics and value the voices from the community instead of the university. So this is really when we're focusing on communities, our students, and the work they do to shift the power. As we all know, so much of the power rests at the institutions, be it R1 schools, state universities, community colleges. Typically, communities look at universities, you are the experts, but in reality, the experts are the community. And we need to value that knowledge as we do work. It also recognizes that the burden of anti-racist training can no longer rest on students and educators of colors. White faculty and the institutions at large must commit the time and focus to develop anti-racist practices and structures. They must decenter whiteness and center, as I just mentioned, the wealth of knowledge that communities of color possess. The next element is rejects working on a community to instead working with a community. This is a big part of what I do in my work with communities, is how do we develop this equitable relationship? I'm sure all of you know the faculty who goes into a community, studies them for a paper they're writing, writes the paper, never even shares the paper, may get an award or two, and the community's gotten nothing from it, or similar stories to that ilk. And the fact is, the community needs to be involved from ideation through dissemination, and with them taking the lead in the knowledge portion of it, and with them identifying needs. We must have the community identify the needs. And this also repudiates the idea of white saviorism or charity. That's not why we're going into the community. So those are key parts of it. So section 1 of our edited volume was on Principle 1. And there were about 5 chapters. And all of the chapters primarily emerged from or were inspired by the pandemic and racial reckoning of 2020. But it was very clear that these case studies in Principle 1 were not one and done. They were not performative. They were really intentionally done, and lots of reflective thinking occurred based on them. I'm going to discuss one of the chapters, chapters 2, Nurses of Color Voices. This project sought to address the systemic racism present in the nursing profession, both that nurses experience and that patients experience. What's nice about this chapter is it can be replicated for any discipline. All disciplines experience racism, and it can be easily replicated. So this began during COVID, when the racial disparities were really blatant in the nursing profession, and they decided to launch a 5-week Zoom session across the country that had a lot of participation to create a space for nurses of color to share their stories about what's happening during COVID, to share their stories about experiences 50 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 minutes ago, to share their stories. And they did it in a way that centered the voices, the nurses of color. White nurses who also joined weren't there to speak. They were there to listen. And there was a whole session on how to listen effectively that was done. After this 5-week session completed, 6 of the nurses decided they wanted to continue meeting and to develop a documentary project titled Reckoning with Racism in Nursing. And they put out a very detailed call for people to narrate the stories. And they identified a training program for people to lead, the narration discussions. And the idea was to really counteract the dominant narrative so often told by the white voices in the nursing profession. There was a very detailed process for the interviews that was at all times focused on centering the voices of nurses of color, and decentering white voices if white voices were involved in this. It really sought out to build the cultural wealth of the communities of color and empower them to be in charge of their narratives. The participants shared how they felt a new sense of power in their profession. That shift of power dynamics was real. So again, it's their intellectual work. It was co-created. And in the end, 37 documentaries were created. A website was created and 2 symposiums were created. It's live. It's available for people in the nursing profession to use as a teaching tool. And like I said at the beginning, while this project was done in the nursing profession, it can be done in any discipline. So with that, I am gonna shift it to my partner, John, to begin a short discussion. We're gonna do about six and a half minutes discussion on each principle. So thank you, John.
Thank you, Cynthia. So I put into the chat while Cynthia was talking a link to all of the principles and all of the elements, so that screen that she showed you at the very outset with a whole bunch of data on it is behind that link, and you can call it up and you can drill into principle 1 for this discussion, and then principle 2, 3, and 4 as we move through this hour. So our question to you for this part is, how can this principle be integrated into your pedagogy, your practice, your institutional culture, or your engagement with community? And there are a couple of sub-questions here. What are you already doing in relation to this principle, and how does that look? Or what would you like to be doing in relation to this principle, and what might help you do that? And so we'd like to invite you for the next 5 minutes now to think about these questions and put a few responses of yours into the chat. And we'll pull out a couple, 1 or 2 to focus on. This will also be resources for Patty and Kimberly when they come to the deep dive in the second hour of this session. So how are you already using this principle? Or what would you like to be doing in relation to this principle?
Can I stop the share so that everyone can see each other?
Yeah, that's fine.
Go back to it.
Would you like me to pause the recording while we're thinking?
I think we'll get into discussion pretty quickly. So people watching the recording can take the quiet time to think also. And if you find it too hard to put something in the chat, you could just unmute and raise your hand and start speaking.
So John, I'm going to jump in here without raising my hand because I
Okay.
think it's a really important question. And in the work that I have been doing, and Kimberly and I have been colleagues for quite a while now, and some of the work that's come out of our bringing theory to practice uh, ventures, we have found the need, obviously, to really bring in that student voice. And I think this is key also to the work of many organizations like Bringing Theory to Practice, where it's taking, I always like to say, flipping the script. How do we kind of flip the script from that traditional model of being in the classroom where it's a lecture based, and you know, it's the sage on the stage sort of model, but how do you become the guide on the side? And so I think, you know, that's a big part of what I'm getting out of this kind of work. And I know you're focusing on one aspect, but I think it is that community voice. How do we bring in the community? This is, I know on our campus in particular, this is an issue. While we may focus on certain kinds of community, particularly in the business and economic world of our valley, we don't sort of bring in those other components, particularly the nonprofits. And I think, you know, having those voices heard, the full gamut is so very, very important. And having their voices heard along with the voices of the students, because our students are the ones, particularly in a community college setting, that are living in the community and who are working firsthand with these particular organizations.
Yeah. And so that actually is exactly what Cynthia was talking about in terms of the cultural wealth of the students. They know the communities they live in. They know the challenges and they know the resources that exist in those communities. And so if we want to take on an asset-based approach as we think about working with the community around the college, the students can guide us in understanding what some of those assets in the community are that we might connect with and join hands with and build upon.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here too, John, as well. Patty, thanks for getting us started on this. I'm looking at Crystal's comment here about intersectionality, and I do think that when we talk about community wealth of our students, it crosses so many lines that extend even beyond race, right? A lot of our students are dealing with issues around gender identity. They're dealing with issues around socioeconomic status and what that brings. Religion can come into play quite a bit, at least in our community, for expectations of roles and behaviors. And so it gets very complex really quick. But I think one way to position those voices is I like to use a constructivist model in the classroom where there's choice and there's voices and we talk through some of these things. And most of those topics are brought up and surfaced by students, right? So we kind of set the stage with the theoretical frameworks, but then there has to be like this flexibility in the instruction to go places in that conversation that the students find compelling. And I'm going to add generational to this too, because I think so much of us come in with that generational lens and what's important to us and concerning to us. Oftentimes, to my surprise, sometimes it's not what is concerning the youth today, especially if you're at least in a traditional class. I think of the work of Corey C. Miller, who we've had on this talk before, and she looks at Generation Z. And I'm always fascinated by her research because things come up that they're concerned about or not concerned about, that us generations older than, the millennials, the X's, the boomers, we just have such a different frame of reference on some of these things. So I really appreciate this idea of centering community and community broadening, right, beyond race, because that's one important component, but there's so much more, right, that gets fed into those discussions.
So thank you, Kimberly. What we're doing in this hour is a really quick skim over the surface of this deep and complicated set of issues. And so we want to move now to our second principle and again have a little bit of conversation about that, and then the third, and then the fourth. And so Cynthia, if you will share the screen with principle 2. Great. Okay, so the second principle calls on us to reflect critically on how racism has gotten into us individually and how we are located in a society with systemic or structural racism. So our own positionality, how are we positioned? What are the identities? And as you just said, Kimberly, it's not only the racial identities, it's all the different identities that are assigned to us that intersect with one another. And that's the last bullet here. We acknowledge intersectionality because we get into all the different forms of privilege and oppression if we're really looking at our social identities and how they play out. So also to critically reflect on the ways that we have learned to carry and express bias without necessarily intending to. A whole lot of the bias that gets played out is unintentional bias, but it nonetheless has its impacts. And then also to have some critical reflection on the historic roots of this whole system. It's not like we invented it yesterday. It's like we all grew up in a system, if we grew up in this country, that had been generating these patterns for a long time. And so this principle calls on us to question bias and question false histories and false narratives that justify or legitimize the status quo. For community engagement, it includes critical reflection before students go into that engagement. It includes it during the period of engagement, and it includes it at the end of engagement after you've concluded whatever it is that you're doing. It considers how the very knowledge that we believe we hold has been created in ways that have racism embedded in it. And for instance, if the only knowledge that counts is the knowledge of the academy, the college or university, that excludes the knowledge that exists in the communities with which we're engaging. And it excludes, and a lot of that knowledge is often presented, knowledge in our colleges and universities is presented as having been generated by white folks like me. And that's only a portion of what we need to be considering, drawing on and taking in. This principle, and you'll see this theme appearing in other principles also, promotes dialogue with community partners. How are we going to do what Cynthia told us is part of principle one, work with community identified needs unless we're in dialogue with community partners? And so how do we ask appropriate questions, and how do we listen and not just see ourselves as the experts who are going to work on, not with the community? This principle calls on us to address the challenges that minoritized students experience. And as Kimberly pointed out, it addresses intersectionality. I want to take a couple of minutes to share with you Chapter 11, which is entitled The Washington County Community Remembrance Memorial Marker. And it's by Valandra, Roanne Elliott, and LaShonda Fields. And in that chapter, these three authors tell us about a project, the Washington County Community Remembrance Project, which took place when two of the authors attended the grand opening of the Equal Justice Initiative National Monument for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And they realized the power that creating memorials to those individuals who were victims of racial violence over the past is a powerful way of beginning to come to terms with that history. And they decided they would build a partnership with other folks to construct a historical marker in their own county, Washington County, Arkansas, to memorialize 3 enslaved Black men who we only know by their first names, Anthony, Aaron, and Randall, who were victims of racial terror lynching. They called together other folks, both from the University of Arkansas and from the community of Washington County, to figure out how they might do this. They wanted to set history straight about what happened here in this county where we live, that needs to be recognized, acknowledged, and understood. They dedicated this to disrupt a culture of misinformation, silence, and complacency about the history of racial terror in their area. Their coalition was about half Black and half white, so it was a multiracial coalition. And one of the biggest challenges that they addressed was, how do they learn collectively with each other about what it is they needed to do? And they describe in one of their practice portions, the necessity was to take the time this learning requires and avoid rushing through or glossing over racial questions or issues, and then proceed through difficult conversations that honor our love for our ancestors, the real stories of their lives, our own lives, and our shared commitment to truth. And this requires us to show empathy for ourselves and others as learners, and to communicate about racial and cultural issues directly, taking the risk to express ourselves honestly, ask questions, and ask for, provide, and seriously consider feedback. They have a lot more to say in this chapter about the process they went through that led to the creation of a memorial marker that stands at the first graveyard for African American people in their county. So that's my timer telling me I used all the time I had for that portion. Principle 2, how can this principle, which is, I'll remind you, the principle of critical reflection on individual and systemic structural racism, understanding positionality, bias, and historical roots of systemic racism. How can this principle be integrated into your pedagogy, your practice, your institutional culture, or your engagement with the community? What are you already doing that does that, or what might you like to do? And we can again put some stuff into the chat. We can also, if you'd like, just unmute yourself and speak up. This is a small enough group, we can do that.
Yeah, I would recommend people just speaking up. It's probably easier that way, and that's the way.
Yeah. Good.
So John and Cynthia, I'm happy to kind of start it off again, because this reflection component I think is so very, very important. And especially when you are dealing with students and hearing, I always like to say, hearing their stories. It's important for, as someone, I was talking about the importance of storytelling, and her response was, but also think in terms of sharing. So, you know, you're getting to hear this where folks are coming from. And I just used one example, and I know that you made reference to the concept of dialogue. And I think dialogue is so incredibly important when you're in these kinds of settings, especially if you bring in both community members along with a campus community. You get to hear their stories, and the way that they look at things and their perspectives are oftentimes very different. And so you're not going to find that out until you start to have those kinds of questions that allow for that kind of reflection and that kind of dialogue where you can go back and forth in sharing. So I think that is very important.
Okay. And Crystal, your hand is up. You get to go next.
Thank you. So we try really hard. I'm a tutoring center director. We have about 150 tutors, and you know, this work is absolutely critical, right? Because these are students, and they're also in a position to empower or oppress other students, right? And so this is a big part of our training. And I think that one of the things that we've learned over the years of having conversations about anti-racism and culturally responsive pedagogy and culturally responsive tutoring is that it can't be done in a single exposure, right? Sometimes we just have a workshop and we're like, yay, like we had our workshop, right? What we've found and are still learning, right, as we go, is that this really takes multiple exposures and years of culture building around learning how to have these conversations, do it in ways that make sense to folks, do it in ways that empower folks to speak up for themselves, and so on. And so, you know, we have a conference every semester. Our last tutor training is dedicated to culturally responsive tutoring. And you know, we have learned over the years to sort of expand what that means. It means anti-racism, it means advocacy, it also means mental health and community care. It also means, you know, talking about what it means to be a college student and surviving in college. And just sort of like watching this grow and evolve over time has really humbled me and helped me learn that we all have so much to learn and so far to go, that we really need to really think about building an ongoing recursive culture of having this conversation for years and years over time. So, thank you for this. This is so good.
Crystal, I am guessing that in that work that you do with your tutors, that it's weighted a lot in the direction of inviting the student tutors to reflect on their own experience, to say, okay, here's a challenge that came up and here's what I did with it. And I'm not sure what I did with it was the most useful thing to do. And then the group could think together about, well, what are some other possible ways of dealing with that challenge that might have led to different outcomes? And it's that recursive process that you don't just do it once. You do it once and you kind of get it and you kind of don't get it. And then you got to do it more in different settings. And each time you do it, you get it a little bit more.
Yeah, and that piece, John, about empowering our students, our community members to be doing the leading and the facilitating conversations is so absolutely key. And one of the lessons that we've learned is we do better work when we can train somebody to facilitate the conversation. We're there, but really we are the guide on the site, and it's the tutors and students themselves who are leading the conversations. Thank you.
Okay, there's so much more we can dig into here, but we're going to pause this conversation to go on to Principle 3. And back to you, Cynthia.
Yes, let me just get this. I'm getting going back and forth here. Okay, so Principle 3 is about intentional learning and course design. It's about developing anti-racist learning goals, course content, policies, and assessment. It's really making sure that these anti-racist learning goals, contents, policies, and assessment are central to course design, that they're woven through, they're not an add-on. The biggest, the most important part is that it's not a one and done. It's not an add-on. Okay, so this lesson will be anti-racist. but then we'll teach our regular way the rest of the class. So it's really focusing on all your practices as you're, as you're being intentional in this design. And as you'll see in all the principles focus on something different, but there's a lot of overlap in the elements because we really are focusing on how we can be mindfully equitable and anti-racist with our community partners and students. So this one really calls upon us to rethink our approach to community engaged courses, like I said, so that they have an anti-racist approach in their content, and that there is a focus on student preparation, especially of our white students, so that they are prepared to go into communities, because otherwise the amount of harm that can be done is really not okay to send them into the communities. That we focus on the role of community partners and students in the project, and that we make sure we have diverse forms of assessment. When we work with our community partners, as we've mentioned before, we really want to come to terms with the community assets and focus on asset-based work with our communities. Stop this deficit-based approach that has been done for centuries. And really attend to the multiple spoken languages of a community, the multiple voices, and like we've said before, the cultural wealth, what the students bring to their communities, to their project, to the knowledge we are discussing, and what the communities bring to the same spaces. We want to equip our students to understand the communities, and the communities could be a physical community that they're going into. It could be a virtual community, etc. So, but make sure that they understand it, that as we've mentioned before, we're highlighting the different ways of knowing and valuing knowledge, that we're involving community partners as co-creators of syllabi, and you'll hear about that in the example I'm about to give. So that it's not like, here's a syllabi, please go do this with my student in your community and I'll see you in 22 hours or whatever it might be. That they're really part of it, they're brought into the classroom, or the classroom goes to them depending on different transportation abilities campuses have, so that the community partner is part of the whole course design, and that allows for a diversified course content. This also ensures that there's community and student voice, which then leads to community and student agency, which is one of, the ideals out of the project. And finally, and again, this project that I'm about to discuss, we'll talk about it, it focuses on diverse forms of assessment. So now I'm going to give you an example, chapter 14, which is centering counter stories. And for those that might not know, counter storytelling is a method of storytelling for marginalized people to intervene in the dominant narrative that's out there based on ignorance and assumption. So this is about centering counter stories in anti-racist podcasting pedagogies by Brooke Covington and Cameron Betfon. So this project really seeks to show how community partners and students can work together to co-create knowledge that highlights the wealth of community, the wealth of communities and people who reside in that community, who have resided in the community over the years. The project that occurred was called the Tidewater Project, and it took place at Christopher Newman University, which is a PWI, predominantly white institution in Virginia, built in the 1960s by seizing land and displacing a small but very vibrant African-American neighborhood. A Black CNU alumni, who is now CEO of a local gun violence prevention and intervention nonprofit, had survived a near fatal gunshot wound in 2015, and at that point committed himself to fostering grassroots community resilience and change within the CNU community and greater community. And at the same time, a CNU faculty member had just attended a podcasting institute by the National Institute of Humanities. And the two of them paired up for a project that would use podcasting as an anti-racist community engaged tool for decentering whiteness at CNU, which again is a primarily white institution, and amplifying the stories. So that goes back to what you were saying, Patty, the focus on stories of community members who have been marginalized. And what they did was, this was in a intro to civic engagement and social justice course, and they broke the students up into small groups, and students got to choose community partners and the issue that they would work on to do the counter storytelling and podcasting. There was a lot of attention to detail with co-creating the content within the partnerships, and they prioritized the community storytellers. At every aspect, the community storytellers were prioritized. They highlighted assets, their spoken languages, and their cultural wealth. And this allowed students, and this was such an important part of the project that they spoke about for a while, to learn about the community by bearing witness to firsthand stories instead of the dominant narratives often told on the media. This project, which I mentioned was in that Intro to Civic Engagement course, the topics chosen for these projects became the syllabi. The syllabi was not created September 1st. Once the projects were chosen, that became the syllabi, and the community partners and students worked to figure out the topics that were going to be discussed on a weekly basis as they were developing their relationship and creating this podcast. They worked collaboratively in every aspect with the community member or community partner having final say over each and every aspect. And it takes a long time, because all of you know, when you work with community partners, I mean, we have our institutional calendar. So, you know, there were challenges with a 15-week semester and suggestions they had for doing it a second and third time. But one of the most interesting parts of it was the way this can be used as an anti-racist assessment tool. We see how it can be used as an anti-racist teaching tool. But so often with assessment, knowledge is demonstrated through tests, through papers, even, you know, classroom presentations, and they require a demonstration of standard academic English. Well, that's not equitable assessment. Podcasts embrace linguistic diversity and do not force students or the community members to demonstrate the standard academic English in demonstrating the knowledge they learn to meet the course outcomes. So really inherent, as I mentioned, in Principle 3 is the intentionality that anti-racism is not an add-on to course design, but a central nexus to which all aspects of community and course partnerships flow as an approach to combat white supremacy that can harm students and communities alike. So I'm just looking at time. I think we should move to John talking about Principle 4, and then we'll discuss.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Cynthia. So Principle 3 talked about course design. If we're a faculty member responsible for teaching courses, what do we need to recognize, consider, and build into our design of courses? So Principle 4 moves on to think about, well, what do we do when we're actually in the classroom with the students? How do we use whatever the design is that we have built to make the classroom both reflective and compassionate, to work to build a sense of belonging in the classroom for every student by meeting those students where they are, which requires us, if we're the faculty, to learn where they are so that we can attempt to meet them there. To do that, again, we're highlighting intersectionality, that our students are not just one thing. Any one of them is not just one thing. Every one of them is a bunch of things. And for us to meet them where they are, the more we can learn about who they are and where they are, the more fully we can meet them where they are. As we're working together on, especially on this kind of emotionally charged material, it's easy for folks to fall into microaggressions, to say things in ways that are going to land on someone else with harm. And whether or not that's intended, and as I think we know, much of the time it's not intended to cause harm, but it causes harm anyway. So if we're working to create a compassionate and reflective classroom, we need to recognize when microaggressions happen. We need to stop the flow to respond to them in a way that is compassionate. And that's a huge challenge. We could spend the next hour just talking about how do we do that. And we would not complete that topic, but it would be well worth the time. Also, the compassionate, reflective classroom provides space for healing. Not just healing from what just happened, but healing in a larger sense, because all of us have been immersed in a culture of systemic racism, and all of us, both people of color and white folks, are carrying the wounds from that socialization process that we have gone through. And so, to what extent can we construct a space for healing with our students? Compassionate Reflective Classroom also recognizes community-based work that has already been done and that is already being done by our students. I know when I first learned about service learning, it was all about going into a relationship with a community organization to do something for that organization. And I've come to recognize that a lot of our students are already actively working to build capacity for the common good in their communities. If they are in families whose first language is not English, they may be translating for their parents as they go through interactions with government and other people who hold positional power. They may be doing all sorts of community-based work that could be drawn upon to inform a community-engaged course without saying, well, you have to go do this thing because you're already doing stuff. So how do we acknowledge what they can contribute, and at the same time not call on them to be our informants? There's a lot we could say there. The chapter I would like to give you just a quick snapshot of is the final chapter in the book. It's entitled, "The Class Feels Like It Should Be Illegal: Latinx Experiences and the Promise of Anti-Racist Pedagogies." And Aldo and Francisco are faculty members at Worcester State University, and they told the story of a course that they developed and taught jointly. Aldo's a historian, Francisco is a sociologist, so they brought those two disciplines together in a community-engaged course. And they tell the story of a lot of things. But what we haven't said is that each of these 22 chapters is constructed around the same template. The authors start out by giving us the case, the story of what it is that they're telling us about. And then they draw out from that case a set of practices that they drew upon, that they used in their work in that case. And then they conclude with drawing connections to, well, what does this story have to do with issues of pedagogy and pedagogical change, with issues of institutional change, with issues of community change. And there's one more I'm blocking on, but 4 different kinds of change that they could see connected. So Francisco and Aldo both are Latinx faculty members. Both are, those identities are held differently by each of them because they're from different places, Puerto Rico and El Salvador. They look different. They've been dealt with in different ways. One was an immigrant, one was not. And so they shared their own stories as a basis for inviting their students. And this particular class that they're talking about is predominantly Latinx in a PWI, a predominantly white institution. And so they invite their students to share their stories. And then they give the students readings about issues of privilege, power, and oppression. And they ask the students to interrogate those readings from their own experience. They ask the students to create a glossary. Each student creates their own glossary of key terms, drawing on their own experience. And at one point, one of the students says, "This class feels like it should be illegal because it counts our experience as mattering so much to the core of the class." So that's a really quick summary of, there's a lot more in the chapter that I invite you to read. But let's move to a final discussion of what you see. How can this principle be integrated? And we could go back to principle 3 as well, the principle of course design and the principle of running the classroom to be a compassionate, reflective classroom. How are you already trying to do that? Or is there something we've said that triggers a thought, oh, I don't really do that, but I think I might want to? What might you want to share? And I know we have at least one, maybe more than one student in this group. And so you might want to tell those of us who are faculty or administrators what we need to recognize from your experience, where these principles have actually been applied by faculty you've worked with, or where you wish they had been applied, what it might have looked like.
Well, I'm not a student, but I can jump in here.
I was gonna, you beat me to it. We're the ones that we can't handle the silence. So go ahead, Kimberly.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated the idea of, having a conversation with community partners about the syllabus, because I think, our syllabi have to reflect our course outlines of record, right? So there is only so much latitude. Like, you can't have someone totally redesign a course for you that veers from that too much. But I think it could be a lot of input around activities and assignments and lists that could be interesting depending on, what you're trying to achieve there and what kind of community organization you're linking up to. So that would be I'd be interested to see more examples of like befores and afters. Like, here was a syllabus before that collaboration and
Mm.
those conversations, and here's a syllabus post. That would be just fascinating.
And often
Mhm.
that collaboration on syllabi or course content is around the idea of the knowledge, like what are you teaching? So, you know, they may not say do this assignment, but it would be like, you know, if you're going to be teaching about food injustice, then here's some really interesting reports your students should be reading about the community that's here. So in terms of, you know, and then that shapes, oh, well then if I'm going to be sharing this, let's do it this way. And if you could come in and talk about it, since you were, so it's that sort of collaboration where you're discussing and you're working with, and you're not discounting that, you know, they're the community, will go in and help them, but they're part of the entire, yeah, soup to nuts, the project.
Victoria, I see your hand. I'd love to hear what you'd like to contribute.
Thank you. I feel very appreciated. So as a student, I'm currently at Cal State Northridge in their Master of Social Work program. And something I've noticed that not all professors, but a few throughout my time in the program have offered our contribution like to the syllabus, exactly as Cynthia and Kimberly were just kind of saying. And most recently, I think one of the things I really appreciated was an in-depth discussion about the readings that we were assigned, because some of
Mhm.
the books are still rooted in like very white-centric perspectives, very Eurocentric perspectives, and
Mhm.
you know, they're clinical books or they're advocacy books, so they don't necessarily cover everything that we want, but just the discussions that we've been able to have about that and the critiques that
Mhm.
we have about the reading or the articles, like they have been taken in stride. And that's just something that's been really effective in kind of garnering more community within the classroom.
Mm. So I'm curious, Victoria, is one of the responses from the faculty member to explore how a broader range of perspectives could inform the readings? Uh, could some of those readings be replaced by stuff that's authored by people of color?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know what the research might look like for trying
Mhm.
to find like really equitable textbooks or even just like autobiographies, because some of the things we're reading aren't just textbooks. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, there is discussion on how do we include like more people of color, more people with disabilities, more people of
Mhm.
indigenous identities.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, lots of conversations about that, but sometimes difficult to find.
You know, and I think the OER, the Open Education Resource Revolution, with more and more colleges embracing it, is bringing in diverse voices and equitable practices for affording a textbook that once wasn't affordable.
Mhm. Yeah, if you're not familiar with OER, that's a really powerful tool, because the whole idea there is to have access to stuff online that is at worst low cost, but at best no cost. And you can then have that as a resource for the class and a whole set of things that are resources.
John, do you want me to put it back so you can just finish the last slide before we turn it back over to
Sure.
Kimberly?
Sure.
I'm sorry, I don't know how to raise hand here for some reason.
Oh, it's all
But
right. You have a contribution, please make it.
yeah, I wanted to confess.
Uh-huh.
I was teaching students who are justice involved inside the prison, and remember when I just started, they're very limited in their access to any resources. So whatever instructors bring to them is what they have usually
Mhm.
for the contemporary information. And I remember how I was bringing them articles and I was teaching economics to them. And first, I was bringing stuff that was interesting to me, like, for example, food gentrification. And then along them, I was bringing some current event with truckers, for example, truck driver shortages. And then I asked them, what do you guys think? And then they said that actually, like, bring us more articles about trucker drivers. And first I thought, oh, it would be too easy, or there's a shortage of Christmas trees at that point. And then I realized that it's actually like I was who was making choice initially, but then I started asking them and relating them, and now it's justified. But I had that moment where it's like I thought that they wanted easy topics, but that was actually what was interesting to them.
What a powerful revelation that is when we can ask our students what it is they want to learn, and they tell us stuff we hadn't thought of.
John, I was just going to jump on that, say something with what you just mentioned. I love that example that you were using in the last principle that came out of the Latinx study, and what the students were talking about, because I thought that was a great example of them really reflecting upon themselves personally. But at the same time, I think it goes back to the comment that was just made. You know, it's also expressing something that they are interested in. And as instructors, I think what we can do is take that information, use it in such a way that it also becomes a way, I hate to use this term, enrollment management, but we all know that it is very much a component of our daily teaching, in the sense of we want to make sure students complete. And so if you can at least tap into those interests that again stay focused and have that academic component, that's a great way of keeping those students connected. And I think that's also a way that maybe we look at this as a way of hopefully ensuring that, you know, they have a greater ability to be successful and complete the course.
And, you know, as you're saying that, Patty, I'm thinking about stuff that I didn't have give myself enough time to get into. Like one of the topics they ended up talking about was the challenges for in the community where this university was located, the challenge of affordable housing for low-income people. And the way they got to that was some of the students shared their stories about the challenges in their own families of finding and staying in a place to live that they could actually afford. And then they went from that to the literature about the sociological literature about housing affordability and what determines what in that area of theory. And the students could see how their own experience actually made the theory make sense. And so, Victoria, you've got something else.
Yeah, my brain is activating. But I wanted to respond to Sveta, because what you're saying about the class, like, and how you were able to interact with them, it really sounds like they were able to join you and you were able to join them in their interests. And thank you, Crystal. And I think like that is very core to how like I feel connected in a classroom, because it's one thing for a professor or anyone in authority to bring information that they care about, but then also to create dialogue about it and ask, do you care about this as much as I do? And also, what else do you care about that you want to see more of? Like it's difficult to integrate everything, but to have that conversation, like I think that was really powerful. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, you're so correct. And that's again going back to appreciating and valuing the knowledge, the cultural wealth of the students in the classroom. So that's, you know, great practice.
Okay, so, oh, one more hand up, Cindy.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Cindy. I'm from Bridgewater State University. I was kindly invited by Dr. Reif to attend today. And it's funny that y'all are talking about this subject because at Bridgewater, the environment on campus is more so of an inclusive and equitable status where everyone, including faculty is involved in pretty much helping students understand why it's important, especially students that are in leadership positions that can impact the student body. It allows them to attend events that are put together by faculty and administration to help them understand what involving in community service and giving back, what that really means. In some cases, there isn't a lot of focus on that because I think for me, it's like the generation gap that you all were talking about previously. That if a student is not facing the phone or some type of electronic device and they are in key with especially since COVID, what's going on within their communities and how it's changed and what they want to give back, I think if they're a student leader, it helps breed that kind of conversation where in other meetings where there's similar certain student leaders that they have these conversations and they share information and they get together and they really look for ways to impact their communities without anybody having to tell them that. It's nice to be able to be included in something like this, to have that discussion where that people are like Dr. Reif is and his team at the Board of Higher Ed is understanding the value of students' voices and including them in conversation that will help them understand why is it important for us to be able to understand where they're headed and what they want to lead us and how we could help them, kind of like a help me help you kind of situation. And that right now is really, really, really important for a student to get involved in their communities because I don't really think that they understand the whys and it's never been nurtured in them to have a say where, you know what, you can really impact your student in your neighborhoods, kids that you grew up with or kids that are attending your school, even with community involvement. So I think it's really nice that you all are, kudos to you all for bringing this conversation to life and wanting to hear student input. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Cynthia, why don't we move to our last slide and we'll conclude our part of managing this time and turn it back to Patty and Kimberly to bring the group into the deep dive. So, okay, so the work continues. As Cynthia described, initially we started with a grant project. We created together a consortium that we called the New England Equity and Engagement Consortium. That consortium then generated a framework for civic learning through a lens of racial equity. And that's a tool that we have begun to use in faculty development and are aiming to use a lot more in faculty development alongside the principles for anti-racist community engagement. We did a set of regional workshops. We have done a set of book launch celebrations with the book and with people in different locations, both in Massachusetts and nationally. There's a set of author talks that Campus Compact has sponsored with our editing team, and there's still a couple of those left coming up. You can find them if you put the name of the book into the search tool on the Campus Compact website, which is compact.org. And then you can find out what we're scheduled to do when in the remainder of this semester. we're also doing a 4-hour exploration of the book at a pre-conference workshop at the Campus Compact annual meeting in April in Denver. And beyond that, we're just looking to have conversations with folks about these principles and what they might mean for your own practice.